Good morning, everyone, and thanks for jumping on. Hopefully, we'll be getting a few more on in just another minute or two. But I wanted to thank you all for joining. This meeting is recorded. So this is coffee and soil testing. We're recording this so you can come back and watch it later in case there's some really good information you want to come back and hear. Or if you want to share with your friends, that would be great too. This morning we have James Wolff with Purdue Extension. He is the director of the Allen County Extension as well as an extension educator. He's going to be sharing on how to interpret a soil test as well as a little bit on how to take a soil test. And he has been doing this for the last couple years for us, and every single time I've learned something, and there's always something new to learn, and as always, really good information. So, with that, James, I'll let you take it away. And thanks for joining us this morning.
All right, yes, welcome. So you should be seeing my presentation screen now. So we'll start. The general title of my presentation this morning is just understanding soil test results. So as Joelle said, we're also going to cover a little bit of taking a soil sample. So I'm James Wolff. I'm the agriculture natural resources educator here for Purdue Extension here in Allen County. And if you're joining us from another county, we do have an educator in all 92 counties, so you can reach out to your local educator if you have questions. Some of the things here we might discuss are maybe a little bit more Allen County specific, but they still generally apply. If I get the right buttons. So just so we're all on the same page, because if you don't do your soil samples correctly, your soil sample results mean nothing. It's kind of like garbage in, garbage out situation. So before we get to that whole soil sample thing, we want to talk about the general procedure you should have. Generally, you want to make sure that you're gathering all the supplies you need to take a soil sample. You want to have a clear surface of debris, so you don't want to get a bunch of the lawn in there. You don't want to get a bunch of leaves. You don't want to get a bunch of, maybe you put manure or compost should be worked in with the soil, but maybe you put a bunch of manure on there. You want to make sure you're not getting all of that, because that's going to throw your results off. Generally, in most of our urban ag situations and our lawn situations, we're really looking at that 4 to 6 inches, maybe 4 to 8 inches. With crops out in row crop situations, we're more trying to get to that full 1/8 depth as far as how deep we're going to stick the probe into the ground. I usually also like to maybe tape mine or mark my probe so I know exactly how far to go down into the soil. You need to get a bucket, so you need to have a bucket handy. We always recommend a plastic bucket. And then you need to collect at least 5 probes for every area you're in. That should get you pretty close to that 2 cups, because most of our soil labs that we work with require 2 cups of soil to do their test. This makes sure that they have plenty of soil in case they need to rerun a test. But it gives you a good representation of the area that you're sampling. There's lots of different tools you can use to collect soil samples. We really don't have any one recommendation over the other. It's really nice if you have a soil probe like here in the center to take basically that probe of that soil. That's really what we're looking at. But you can accomplish it with other tools. Not everybody has those. So shovels, even these nice little bulb planters could work pretty well. I guess if you really need to, you can use a spoon. But in most situations, the shovel is probably going to be your best. One thing about a shovel, though, that is kind of challenging is a shovel is not usually square. You have this tapered bottom to it. So if you pull out a slice of that soil, the challenge is the soil doesn't have nutrients in there evenly. So they tend to be more nutrients towards the top, less nutrients towards the bottom. Well, now you're already skewing your soil test result if you cut out a bunch of that bottom area and you have more of the top area. So if you use a shovel and you get this slice of soil out, we recommend thinking about it just like you were trying to take a soil probe. Get rid of all the soil on the left, get rid of all the soil on the right. And you just want that like nice little inch or so straight down the middle, because you're going to get the top and the bottom evenly in that. And you're going to skew that distribution of nutrient when it goes to the lab, mixed in with your sample. So this would be one probe. This would basically be like you probe the ground once. So you should do that at least 4 other times across your area, to get a good representation of the soil in that area. And also make sure that you've accumulated up to 2 cups. So there's days where I might have to take 8, get 8 probes from an area to get to my 2 cups. Some days it seems to go a little bit better, maybe because I'm going a little bit deeper. I'm able to get a little bit more soil. So keep those things in mind. Really our goal is 2 cups, and that could be 5 to 10 probes of that soil to get to that full 2 cups. We always recommend putting it in a plastic bucket, because a lot of our metal buckets tend to be zinc coated. That zinc coating does skew the results. It kind of wipes off onto the soil, and that skews the results. So always use a metal bucket, or not a metal, but always use a plastic bucket to collect your samples in. And then as far as the bag, you put them in. Some of our labs have really nice bags. A&L Labs gives us bags that are lined. They'll actually hold soil that's got a good amount of moisture or water in it. But you can also just use a Ziploc bag. It really doesn't matter. The drier the soil is, the better for the lab. But when some of our clays are super dry, it can be very difficult to get a sample. So that's not a huge factor, but making sure you've got the 2 cups and having it either in a Ziploc bag or in a bag from the lab is recommended. And then when we talk about collecting samples, I try to keep samples of different areas separate. So if we're in a home situation, I've got front yard versus backyard. This area is slightly different than this area, so we want to keep those separate. Generally in a home or small farm situation, I try to recommend 1 sample per acre, because you get a better representation of your soil. If we're dealing with a large scale crop operation, we usually try to recommend 1 sample for every 5 acres. Just because if you've got a 20-acre field trying to do 20 samples, that gets a little expensive. It gets you very accurate results, but gets a little expensive. So we try to recommend at that 5-acre rate, keeping areas that are different. So in this case, I know our backyard here has it's a little wetter and it's a different type of grass. The front yard sits on a big slope, and it's got a different type of grass in there. So I try to keep those separate when I'm sampling. When I go across the area, I try to make a zigzag pattern, as I indicated here on the picture. Usually that M or Z pattern across the area is going to be what gets you that 5 samples that you need. And I always recommend drawing a map of where you marked, especially if you're working in a large field or you're doing multiple samples. Have a map of where those samples came from so that you can match those up with your results when you get them back, to keep that organized well. And then the last thing on, again, the collecting of samples, always make sure 2 cups in a bag. We did have a question this week. Somebody asked us, is that 2 cups using an outdoor measuring cup or an indoor measuring cup? They're all the same. 2 cups are all the same. So, I keep usually a set of measuring cups that I use outdoors and not in my kitchen. I try to keep the soil and everything separate from, and the fertilizer separate from my food. So I have a set of outdoor measuring cups that are labeled for outdoor use, and I always make sure that there's 2 cups worth of soil that gets put into the bag for the lab. Any questions on those soil sampling practices? I kind of went through that real quick. I guess it helps if I could see maybe chat. Doesn't look like anything in the chat, so we'll go
Yeah,
ahead.
if you guys have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat and I'll be happy to share those with James, or you can even unmute yourself or raise your hand and you can ask those questions.
All right, so we'll get to the part that you probably came for, maybe the important part. On the right window. And that's understanding your soil sample results. So this is one version of what lab results could look like when you get them back. So this is a case, probably more of a field crop setting where we've got a whole bunch of samples for an area. They give us the results back, not very graphical, just a bunch of numbers across there in those columns. But it is still gives us all the same information, just laid out a little bit different. You'll notice the top is most of our macronutrients, the things that we're most concerned about. And then across the bottom is our micronutrients, which are the things that we just need in low doses. Usually we're really only looking at those micronutrients if we're already seeing some sort of deficiencies within the plant, to figure out what we need to do to improve that situation. This is probably our most common report that we get back, what it looks like. And again, depending on where you go, you're going to get reports that look a lot different, but they're all going to contain the same information. So it's just a matter of figuring out where that information is laid out. So with this picture, we do have a couple things highlighted in here. So the 2 things that I generally go towards first when I look at a soil sample, first I look at the pH. In this area, pH is usually the biggest factor in how we're managing anything that's growing in the ground, whether that be lawns or corn. That pH tends to be the biggest factor that I see. The next thing I'll look at is the organic matter, because that organic matter does affect some of our nutrients, and can be a factor as we're working with. Usually people come in because they've got problems with their plants in our office. So we're trying to figure out what the balance is in the soil. So I'll go to the organic matter. And then I'll look at the nice little graphic summary below. Sometimes I don't really need to look at the exact number as far as what the exact numbers are up above. That graphic representation gives me a better idea of what's out there. I will say that the labs in town, they prefer, and when they're giving their nutrient recommendations, that those levels, they're really shooting for those levels to be in the high or very high range, is what their recommendations cater to. That doesn't always mean that you generally need to apply nutrient, because like in this situation, our phosphorus levels are low, but we are in a lawn situation. So unless we're seeing some phosphorus deficiency in a lawn, most of our lawns don't need a whole lot of nitrogen. So when I try to tailor those recommendations at the bottom, I'm probably not going to put a lot of emphasis on phosphorus because phosphorus can be an issue within our water system. So I'm going to focus more on the nitrogen aspect for this lawn. But if we were trying to establish a lawn, phosphorus is important for the establishment of the lawn. So those are going to be some differences between results. But this graphic can be pretty good. Generally, this graphic gets shifted if you're doing the micronutrients because they got to try to shove in the micronutrients as well. And then the last thing I look at down here is the soil fertility recommendations. In this case, it's a lawn. So in lawn and garden settings, the recommendations always come in pounds per 1,000 square feet. When we switch over to field crop situations, I believe it switches to tons per acre. So you're just getting a number down here, but if you look up, that's in this case, lawn maintenance for nitrogen. They're recommending during the year 4 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. 3 pounds of phosphate per 1,000 square feet and 2 pounds of potash per 1,000 square feet. And then there's also some little written recommendations down below that help you understand this. Again, splitting that into 3 or 4 applications. So now I'm going to kind of go through individually each of those categories, what they really mean to help you understand that. So our first category, again, that we see, it's usually right next to that lab number. So always make sure that you know, like if you numbered your soil samples, know where sample 1 was taken. That's where that map is important. So organic matter is just looking at that plant material or animal residue that's within the soil. Darker colored soils generally means that there's a higher organic matter. Usually, once we hit 3.5%, it becomes a pretty dark, almost black soil. When we're in our field crop setting, most of the organic matter that I see is in that 1 to 2 range. We do get some now that are up 3 or 4. The people that are using cover crops more or no-till situations. In most of our home settings, we're usually probably in the 3 to 5 range because of grass and compost and leaf material that's been added to gardens and lawns. There's no real magic number to this. I think ideally we're looking for close to 5%. But you can have more, you can have less. If we get too much organic matter in the soil, that does, when you're really looking at if we had a soil around 20 or 30% organic matter, we might start having issues with some of those nutrients because organic matter can tie up nutrients, can cause plants to not be able to access different things in the soil. So even though nutrients may be there, the plant just can't access it because that organic matter is decomposing. So there is such a thing as too much. Anything in excess can be a bad thing. But we still, want a reasonable amount to help balance out the nutrients within the soil. Next, we've got phosphorus. So phosphorus is one we try to pay attention to in this area because it is a nutrient that does get into our water system, and then it makes its way all the way to Lake Erie, and we get wonderful algae blooms on Lake Erie. We try to avoid that, so we try to limit our phosphorus amounts to just what those plants need. So there's 2 different methods that could be reported within your soil sample results. It really is just a difference in how the sample is collected and which way your lab runs the sample. There's actually a third A third way to test for phosphorus, which I think is what a lot of labs are switching to. So sometimes you can't compare your numbers from one lab to the next because they may have run different samples. So always look and see if they gave you the Bray 1 equivalent or the Bray 2, and try to compare those results across or utilize conversions to compare. Really, phosphorus is needed most if we're getting seedlings started. It really helps promote root growth and getting plants started when they're young. So if we're dealing with things like established lawns, we really don't need phosphorus unless we're trying to promote some root growth within that lawn. But when you've got some small plants, when you're just getting started in spring, phosphorus may be important for that. As you get larger plants, more mature plants in your garden later in the year, you really don't need to add that phosphorus at that point. So phosphorus is just for our small plants to try to get that root growth established. But then you really kind of can taper off and not need to apply later in the season. Potassium is a nutrient. We need higher levels in clay soils, and it really helps plants with water regulation, and then it's also used for reproduction. So if you've got in a home situation or a small farm situation, if you've got tomatoes, you want to make sure that your potassium levels are correct, because getting that fruit production on a tomato plant really gets to making sure that it has the right levels of potassium within there. Low potassium means less flowering, less reproduction, less fruit. So if you've got things like lettuce, your lawn, they generally don't need potassium for reproduction because you're really just looking at that green growth on those plants. So, you know, focus on things that your plant's going to need. But in that same token, if we're showing some nutrient deficiencies within the plant that are related to potassium, we may want to double check these numbers and make some applications appropriately to help that plant improve its health. The next set of numbers is usually magnesium and calcium. These two are basically what determines the pH of your soil. If in most of our soils, you're rarely going to see deficiencies if your pH is correct. We generally want to see magnesium at 50 plus parts per million. Calcium is going to vary. A lot of that depends on whether you've got clay or sandy soils. So really what we're looking at with those two is the pH. pH is that level of acidity. Most of our plants, most of the crops we grow, lawns, corn, soybeans, tomatoes, peppers, lettuce, they want to be in that 6 to 7 range. That is where all those other nutrients are most available, because when that pH is balanced in the middle, then those nutrients are accessible to the plant and they don't get bound to the soil particles, or they're not loose and floating away. They're in a perfect balance that makes them available for that plant to just grab them out of the soil and transfer them elsewhere within the plant. So that being said, I will say most of the soil samples I see that come through our office usually are in the 7 to 8.5 range, which means we are more of a very basic soil. Nutrients aren't readily available. We want to try to bring that pH back down, and we do that by adding sulfur. So I'll kind of touch on that in a little bit, but sulfur brings that back down. On the other side of things, we do have occasionally we get samples that are below 6. In those soils, we want to try to bring that pH back up. And we do that by adding lime. So a lot of people think, oh, well, I was always told you need to add lime. So they go out and they lime. You don't always need to lime. We have found that a lot of our pHs have moved higher in our soils. Some of that is a result of the fact that we've got cleaner air. We don't have acid rain. We don't have sulfur raining down on us like we used to, which naturally push that pH lower. So without that sulfur, some of our soils are moving to a much more basic level. So don't just blindly add lime. Again, this is why we sample our soils. So go out there and see what your pH is before you start adding a product. So that's one issue I come across with soils and pH. That's why usually pH is where I go to first. Normally there's a pH imbalance, and that's going to help me figure out what to do with the rest of the nutrients. Cation exchange capacity is what you're going to see reported as CEC. It ranges usually from 10 to 20 is pretty common. 5 to 20 is pretty common. It basically just tells you how well the soil holds nutrients. Sandier soils don't hold nutrients very well. Clay soils tend to be higher. They're going to hold nutrients. So a lot of times we might have to apply a little extra nutrient because it's going to get bound up with the soil particle. And then the last group, so most soil samples that we process, we don't see the micronutrients. You really need these in just trace amounts. I mean, we're talking, like sulfur, 8 parts per million. There's really not much we're working with there. Usually I don't recommend these, like, unless it's your first time soil sampling and you just want to kind of get a baseline of where your micronutrients are, or if you're actually seeing deficiencies within your crop. If you're seeing deficiencies within your crop, we'll usually try to test, see where those levels actually are, so that we can recommend the best action to that to improve. And then there are some specialty crops that do need these. The thing that comes to mind, alfalfa, is usually on the top of my head. I'm more of a row crop person than a garden person. Alfalfa does need boron, so we would usually recommend sampling for boron in an alfalfa crop. There are a couple other, I'm sure there's a couple other specialty crops that those micronutrients are important to help manage. And also occasionally, especially if pH is highly imbalanced, iron can be a thing for lawns because they're not able to get the iron that's there. So we need to just double check those iron levels and maybe add a little extra iron to our fertilizer. So again, just looking at that whole report, we come across, we've got organic matter, we got the sample ID, and then we've got organic matter, phosphorus levels, potassium levels, magnesium and calcium are going to go over here to the soil pH. If our soil pH is correct, chances are these two are just fine and we don't need to worry about them. We usually get a cation exchange, which is really cool numbers for a soil scientist, but as a homeowner, probably not as important. And then down here, we've got those micronutrient levels as well, just to see where those are at. So from there, we can start looking at what we're going to do as a result. Like when we're looking at this, what do we need? So you'll notice I'm going to talk about blueberries first. This is my favorite one. We get probably a dozen people that want to grow blueberries every year. The results come back, and I usually tell them before they even get their results back, they shouldn't even bother trying. In this area, the first thing I go to is that pH of 8.1. Blueberries want their pH at 5. You are not going to get this 8.1 down to a 5 and have healthy plants in the process uh, within the next decade. So don't even try with blueberries. If you really want to grow blueberries in a small scale situation, get a raised bed, bring in soil that has the correct pH. Use a pot with soil that has the correct pH, but planting in the ground, you're not going to get there. So that's my first factor. But if you look at all the other numbers, everything's in that very high or high range. So that down here, when we look at those recommendations, we've got zeros as recommendations for the nutrients, which is exactly what I'd expect. What we do have is 50 pounds per acre for nitrogen. And you're like, well, where was our nitrogen number up top? Well, that's nitrogen's a unique nutrient. The lab does not actually test for nitrogen. Nitrogen is so flexible, ambiguous within our soils that it's really hard to get a reading on it and that reading be accurate even within the month. So we don't even bother to test for nitrogen. Nitrogen doesn't like to stay where it's put. So we really just give recommendations based on what we know the plant needs for good production. Because nitrogen just kind of, it wants to go into the atmosphere. It changes forms really easy. It goes into the atmosphere. It gets, when it rains, some of it gets leached through the soil with the water. It just doesn't like to stay put. Especially with sandy soils, it doesn't like to stay put. Clay soils, it'll stay put a little bit longer, but it just kind of varies. So that's why we always just give a nitrogen recommendation. It's not going to stay there. If you put it on in the fall, chances are by the spring, it's not going to be there. So that's also why we would recommend split applications of nitrogen. Don't put it all on at once. You're going to want a little bit. Like for a lawn, we usually say 2 applications in spring, 2 applications in fall. In your garden, you're going to want a little bit early on. You're going to want a little bit probably midsummer, and then maybe not so much late fall, because nitrogen really is the green growth of the plant. So if your plant is like a lettuce, or you're trying to get or kale, or your grass, even corn early in the season, you're trying to get it to get all that green growth on there. Then once it switches to a reproductive phase, it's not really worried about putting on green growth. So you don't really need a lot of nitrogen. Nitrogen's all those early phases. So we try to focus it then. And then, man, I had another thought and it just escaped to my head. Some of our plants also don't need nitrogen because they're adapted to fix nitrogen from the soil. So those things are going to require less. That would be our legumes, like our beans, our peas, soybeans, alfalfa. Those things are nitrogen fixers. So they're fixing nitrogen in the soil. They've got bacteria on their roots that will change the nitrogen in the soil to a usable form that then lets the plant use that nitrogen. Our next sample here is for a lawn. Again, the first thing I notice is our pH is really high. We're at 8.3. So I'm going to go over here. Organic matter is a little low, especially for a lawn. Usually recommend just leaving the grass clippings on the lawn, leave your leaves on the lawn, mulch them up, let them decompose. That adds some organic matter. But that pH is really the concerning factor. When we look at some of these other numbers across here, yeah, we're very low, but if I've just trying to maintain my lawn, I probably don't need, unless I'm seeing deficiency coloration within my lawn or just unhealthy lawn, I probably don't need to apply much phosphorus. I'm going to focus on the nitrogen application. 4 pounds a year for an established lawn is what we're looking at. You can also see again 3 pounds of phosphate per 1,000 square feet. I mean, that's pretty low. Unless I'm seeing deficiencies, I am not going to be putting it on my lawn, just because most of your lawn fertilizers anyway do not have that phosphorus within them anymore. You will also see down here some recommendations based on the pH. So down here, if you're noticing yellowing, or what we call chlorosis, that's an iron deficiency. So we might need to add a little bit more iron because our iron is tied up with this high pH. Also, again, it recommends, because of the alkaline soil, adjusting that pH. What we generally recommend is no more than about 10 pounds of sulfur per 1,000 square feet each year. You might split that into a couple applications, but that's going to drop you maybe 0.1, 0.2 a year. That's not going to drop you a whole pH level from like an 8.3 to a 7.3. After a year or two application, you might be under 8, like at a 7.9. So it's going to take a while to bring that pH down. So know that. That's why, again, blueberries are really challenging with pHs all the way up here. So try to start bringing down that soil pH. One thing to note, again, if you're mulching your leaves on your lawn, or even in a garden situation where you use leaves or straw as a mulch, when that material breaks down, when that brown material breaks down, it requires nitrogen to break it down. So even if we've applied the recommended rate of nitrogen, if we had a lot of straw or wood shavings or leaf material in that soil, it's going to get tied up in breaking that down first. And you may see some of your plants are stunted in growth. You may see some yellowing in your plants. That's because the nitrogen you thought you applied went first to breaking down that dead material, and then what's left over goes to the plant. So you may need to make some extra applications of nitrogen in those situations. And that's something your lab results are not going to be able to see within. So you've got to add some of those context clues to your garden or your growing situation. Last one here, Christmas trees. We'll notice here the soil pH is at 7, which is really right where we want it. Yeah, you could bring it down, but you want to make sure you don't do anything to push that up. So we don't want a lime. We want to make sure that we're keeping that at 7 or below. Organic matter is at 5%. That's a pretty good level of organic matter. For these graphs will also change because different crops have different needs. So you'll notice again, we're kind of maybe on the lower end of phosphorus. Phosphorus may be important to getting those trees established. So we may need to make sure that we're putting some phosphorus in the soil. The recommendation down here is based on they used to use A&L labs in town. I know used to use the tri-state recommendations. I think they've shifted to a more updated recommendation system, but mostly we use tri-state recommendations from the universities in the area. But you've got a nitrogen level, you've got the phosphorus level, and then the potassium level to try to get those trees established or to maintain those trees long term. And I think that ends what I've got today. So now I'll take questions. I'm sure there's plenty of them.
If you all have questions, please feel free to either put them in the chat or you can just unmute yourself and ask them. This is pretty good group, so I'm expecting some good questions. in the meantime, while people are thinking of their questions, James, how often should someone take a soil test?
Oh yeah, that's a really good one. So I usually recommend taking a soil sample every 3 to 5 years. So unless you're really seeing deficiencies in your the plants that you're growing, generally you're not going to do a lot, change the numbers a whole lot in even 2 years. So we usually say no more than 5 years. 3 to 5 is usually a good window for an average. I do also recommend if you take samples in spring, always take your samples in spring. If you take samples in fall, always take your samples in fall. Because seasonally things change. So you want to try to, when you're comparing your results from one year to the next, you want to make sure you're comparing them in that same window of time to account for some of those seasonal adjustments within the soil.
Thanks, James. All right. Well, if nobody else has any questions, I have more. So,
Okay.
um, okay, when you were talking about mulching and either doing a straw or a leaf mulch, um, with it tying up nitrogen, do you typically see that with when it's incorporated into the soil or even if it's just left on top?
Um, Usually, probably more so when it's incorporated into the soil. When it's on top, you're really only getting the interaction between, I mean, your nitrogen is probably in the soil, and then you're getting the interaction at that where they're touching, trying to break down. But we generally, so if you're mulching just to keep weeds down, you're probably not going to see a huge issue. But if, say, you put a lot of people just put their leaves on maybe their garden bed over winter, and then work that stuff into the soil. I've also even seen like soybeans show nitrogen deficiency, which is
Hmm.
really rare when people have cleaned out their barns over winter and applied their uh, manure if the bedding is really heavy in wood shavings or straw. It has a lot of more of the dry material. You'll see out in crop fields those deficiencies from that manure application. So you can get the same thing in your garden as well.
Oh, I never would have even thought about that, especially with soybeans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so for everyone's benefit, why is it important to get a soil test?
So it's really important to get a soil test because um, it's really I mean, bottom line to me, it's a money thing. So if you get your soil test, you're going to know exactly what nutrients to apply. So one, you're going to save money by not applying excess nutrients. But if you're going to apply more nutrients than you would have without the test, you're going to get healthier plants, which means you're going to get more production out of those plants, which means you're if you're eating them, if it's in your garden, you're going to be eating less from the grocery store, so you're saving money there. Or if you're trying to, in a production setting, you're trying to sell your produce, you're going to get more produce, you're going to get healthier looking produce, you're going to get more money from that produce. So we really want to look at, from that standpoint, to me, the biggest benefit is money, but also the environmental benefit, because if we're not applying excess nutrients, these nutrients don't just sit where you apply them. When we get these heavy rain events, those nutrients move and then they end up in our water system, and then they cause problems within our water system. The city of Fort Wayne draws their water from the St. Joe River. So the city of Fort Wayne has to put more effort into cleaning water that's full of nutrients or whatever. They pass that cost right along to the person using that water through the water bill. Or if it makes it all the way to Lake Erie, Like I said, with phosphorus, we cause those issues with algal blooms in Lake Erie. So that becomes then another big issue. So one, it's, I guess on that environmental side, we're trying to just apply what our plants need and keep it right where we need it. Um, but then that boils down to, managing that cost a whole lot better and making sure that we're not overspending on nutrient and the returns are much greater from healthier plants.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions? Okay, if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. But James, I just want to say thank you
Mhm.
for speaking again year after year. You've been doing it, and I really appreciate it. And this is year 3 of me hearing this presentation, and I actually learned quite a bit. So thank you.
Well,
I
that's good.
appreciate that. Different years, you know different information and can absorb different things. So I appreciate it. And I just want everybody on the call to know that the Allen County Soil and Water District does have a soil testing program. So we can provide free soil testing to those whose properties are in the Western Lake Erie Basin. That's a watershed that encompasses the St. Joseph River, the St. Mary's River, and the Maumee River, as well as the Oglays and the Flat Rock Creek if you're down in the southeast part of Allen County. So we can go all the way up into DeKalb and Steuben counties, a little bit into Noble, a little bit into Wells, and down into Adams counties as well. So if you all have any gardens or lawn, not necessarily lawns, but gardens or farms in those areas that you're looking for some soil testing in, we will provide that, and that's a free service. If you don't have property in the watershed, there are multiple entities that do provide soil testing. Purdue Extension does provide soil testing. And the Indiana Association of Soil and Water Districts also provides soil testing. So James, do you want to talk just a bit about your soil testing program and what's available?
Yeah, so we offer soil analysis services for anybody that brings their samples in. So we don't go out and do the samples, but if you bring samples into our office, it's $20 per sample. And then we give you basically all the results that you saw there is what you get. We do micronutrients. If you wanted to add micronutrients, an extra $10 per sample. And then when you get your results, I have a copy of results, or our horticulture educator has a copy of results, so that you can just call in and we can help you understand what you're looking at on the paper, help give you some more detailed recommendations. We can't tell you where to go purchase your products, but we can at least help you understand what you're looking for and understand how much to apply based on uh, the results. A lot of times we're also just working with, like, people have got unhealthy plants. So usually that goes back to soil. So we recommend soil samples. Um, and we also have a drop-off diagnostic service. So you can either email or phone our trained master gardeners that can help for free if you've got sick plants or need to get something identified, or if you need to bring a sample in for $5. We do a lot of diagnostic services to determine what's wrong with the plant. And then also Purdue University has the plant and pest diagnostic lab. So if it's outside of our realm of expertise, which is very rare, occasionally we do have to send things to the lab if it's a virus or something. They can do extra testing, but they only charge, for people in the state of Indiana, they only charge $11 to send down to the lab. So we do offer some of those extra plant health diagnostic services here as well.
Yeah, and I know several growers who have used the plant diagnostic services through Purdue, and they've been very appreciative. They're like, why does my plant have this mold on it? Or why does it look diseased? And um, Purdue is pretty awesome at being able to help, and especially our local extension. So definitely use that resource um, locally. And then similar to extension, we also are able to give you recommendations on soil tests. So based off of the results you get, we'll set up a meeting and we'll be able to go over those results. So I'm probably not quite as good at it as James is it, but I've learned quite a bit from James, so I'm able to give some recommendations.
Yeah, Jolie,
Yes,
Charles.
Charles.
Uh, he's never mentioned sphagnum and peat moss, and I know Ricky used to recommend that all the time. What is the best use with that, or should I use it?
Yeah,
That is out of my wheelhouse. So,
and I don't have as much familiarity with it. So basically what your peat mosses generally do is they're adding organic matter to your soil. They're adding some creating a little less density. So a lot of our soils around here are a lot of clay soils. So incorporating something that's more organic matter kind of loosens the soil up. And but again, you want to try to balance out where you're not all organic matter within your soil. So adding some of that can help. It does also break down, which gives you a little bit of nutrient, but I don't know that the nutrient value is super high. So that's really, it's mostly the organic matter benefit within your soil to help hold water, to create air spaces within the soil, and not make it so mineral in nature.
Well, I was kind of thinking about using it as a mulch and see how it does that way.
Mm. And that could be, I would maybe recommend talking to our horticulture educator here at the office. She can maybe give some better recommendation on that.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
The other question is on the sulfur. When is the
Yeah.
best time to apply that?
I think the lab usually recommends a fall application of sulfur because it takes time to break down. So if you do a fall application, it's going to help give it time to break down before we actually have active plants growing in the spring. I mean, you could really apply it any time. You just don't want to maybe apply it more directly when you've got to plants that are growing, simply because a lot of that stuff tends to be um, caustic to a plant. It's gonna, harm the plants a little bit. Even our inorganic fertilizers, they've got that salt quality to them, which can kind of burn roots of plants a little bit, depending on how it's applied. So that's again why we want to make sure applications are done a little bit away from roots or with enough time for that to break down a little bit. So fall is usually the recommended, but you can apply, just depending on your situation, apply anytime.
and
Okay.
uh, and back to the discussion on peat, and I believe sphagnum and peat are different. But peat moss is a limited resource. So in my opinion, it's if you can stay away from peat as much as you can, try to. I know it's like in every topsoil that you buy. Um, but peat is a limited resource that comes from bogs, which is a huge carbon sequester in our environment. And even though they have to replace bogs when they remove the peat from them, it takes thousands upon thousands of years to get them back to where they were. So if you can avoid using straight up peat moss, if you have the option, you can. I know for topsoils, it's not impossible, but it's much more difficult to find a topsoil without it. So I totally understand when you need to use it, but if you have the option to avoid it, my recommendation environmentally would be to avoid.
So
Okay.
I also thought of something else, like while we were talking about this. So understanding what nutrients you need to apply, you also need to make sure you understand the nutrient content of your fertilizer source. Uh, most of our stuff that you buy at the store has a nice little number and fertilizer analysis, so you know exactly how much you're applying. But if you are applying manure or or the like, that doesn't always come with a nice little fertilizer analysis. So you don't really know how much nutrient you're applying. And that can vary because animals are not machines. They don't spit out the same level of nutrient all the time. So we usually recommend, if you're using a manure source, A&L Labs in town does do manure analysis. Get an analysis on that so that you know what the nutrient content is, so you know if you're over applying or not with that nutrient in your system.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
Thanks for those questions, Charles. I'm not seeing any more questions. I'll give everybody 1 more minute to ask any more questions. But if we get nothing, James, I just want to thank you again for all of your questions. And if anybody has questions on how to read the labeling on a certain fertilizer you may be looking at, I'd be happy to answer a call. And I'm sure Extension would as well, to answer any questions you may have about how to read those labels. And again, our number is in the chat, and so is the Purdue Extension soil testing website. If you are interested in getting a soil test, which after this, I hope you are. So with that, I'm going to let everybody clear out of here, and I'll dismiss you so you can get on to the rest of your day. But I want to thank you all for joining us, and thank you, James, for speaking again. I appreciate it.
Yep,
Okay.
you're welcome.
okay, thank you.
Have a good day, everyone.